Hello and welcome to Retro Racing Reviews. This time out we're going to be looking at the history of one of the most famous Grand Prix cars of all time, the Lotus 72. But first, some backstory. We're looking here at the Lotus 56B. The Lotus 56 was originally campaigned at Indianapolis in 1968. This is the Grand Prix version from 1971. And the reason I'm showing you this to start off with is just to give you an idea of what Lotus was all about in the 60s, the 70s, and well into the 80s, with Colin Chapman at the helm. Now, with Lotus, I know the old adage is lots of trouble, usually serious. Speaking of which, I do get better at this. I appreciate that's not the best of starts, but the car does get a little bit squirrely under braking. So I'll work on that. So Colin Chapman is pretty much the Adrian Newey of his day. A guy who, when he designed a car and got everything right, it was so far ahead of the competition that it was just unbelievable. This is one of his attempts from sort of the late 60s, early 70s. But he'd had a lot of success during the decade in terms of building lightweight, very fast, very nimble cars. We're going to have a look at a couple just now. As we cross the start-finish line, we're going to cross the Lotus 25, which Jim Clark won the title in 1963, and then the Lotus 33, which he won the title in 1965. Both of these cars, as we cut back to the 56, carrying on its way, both cars were light, tubular space frame chassis. Everything was sort of bolted together for additional strength, and they could also be made very, very light indeed. They broke quite often. That's why Lotus, even somewhat to this day, stands for lots of trouble, usually serious. So Colin Chapman and others, so we're looking at John Cooper and Jack Brabham. But it's mostly focused on the sort of the British end of things. So, taking into account British Racing Motors (BRM), these were known as the garagistas, a somewhat derogatory term coined by Ferrari, essentially meaning those Englishmen in sheds, because that's pretty much how they operated. As far as Chapman and Co were concerned, the way that you went around beating teams like Mercedes, like Ferrari, like Porsche, and the like, were not to try and outgun them in a power race. It was to make things lighter and therefore faster. Anything that comprised excess weight could be shaved off. And he also looked for novel solutions to making cars go faster, like, say, for example, the 56. This is Chapman's attempt to use a unique gas turbine engine, which is why when you listen to this thing, it just sounds weird. It doesn't shift gear. It's very disconcerting to drive. It's just like an automatic. You put your foot down and it goes. And quite frankly, there was nothing like it, and there hasn't been anything like it really up until the hybrid turbos have come in the last few years, in terms of just having a technology that wasn't just a straightforward internal combustion engine. We've had turbochargers, we've had superchargers, but they're just variations on a theme. The 56 was married to a four-wheel drive system, and it was originally debuted at Indianapolis in 1968 before being turned into a Grand Prix car in 1971. Sadly, the problem with four-wheel drive systems, certainly in the Grand Prix car, where Chapman went for low weight to get the speed, is that it's heavy. we're just going to have a quick look at the Lotus 63, which was developed a few years prior to that. You'll see again there's a similar sort of wedge shape, but it's more along the lines of the cigar cars that were prevalent up to the end of the 1960s. So that was again another idea of this time having a conventional Cosworth DFE engine married to a four-wheel drive system. Neither of them really worked all that well. The technology was fantastic. Chapman again years ahead of the curve, but he couldn't get it to work. And certainly with the 63, Graham Hill and Jochen Rindt, the team's drivers at the time, promptly had a go in it and said it was undrivable and a death trap. I'm possibly paraphrasing it slightly, but they were definitely not happy with what Chapman had put in front of them, and they went back to the Lotus 49s, which they'd been campaigning with up until that point. The Lotus 49, very good car, debuted in 1967, went all the way through to 1969 with a couple of early outings in 1970 while they were still perfecting the 72, which we're going to come on to in a second, and then they campaigned that and left these sort of how shall I put it, experimental rocket ships on the cutting room floor. Driving this thing is great. I mean, the four-wheel drive system, you can drift it through corners. If you just have a look at some of the times I'm like for example there, where I'm just beautifully poised and taking it through those bends, when you hook it up, it's lovely, really nice thing to drive. But you can definitely tell when you get in the 72 that the 72 goes a damn sight faster. So we're going to cut across to the 72 now. We're switching circuits. We're going with the Nürburgring Grand Prix circuit. So this is effectively the 72C. The 72 had already effectively won the title for Jochen Rindt in 1970. Unfortunately, Rindt subsequently died in the Italian Grand Prix of that year, having built up an unassailable championship lead. He's the only posthumous world champion, hopefully for all time, and certainly up until this date. The 72 continued on being developed into the C model, which is what we see here, no pun intended. This is the car campaigned by Emerson Fittipaldi in 1971. This is partially me being rubbish and going across the gravel track, but it's also an indication that these tyres were not full slick tyres as yet. They were still they still had hand carving in them. Although mostly speaking they were now smooth. When the 72 debuted, it had sort of grooved tyres, some not quite the same, but certainly similar to the ones that were seen in Grand Prix racing between 1998 and 2008. But that wasn't really to slow the cars down. It was just that full slick tyres hadn't really been developed as a way of making the cars go faster. You'll see as we move on, the bigger the contact patch, the wider the track, the more you're going to get out of the chassis and the road holding. Now that I'm starting to hook up with the 72, you'll see overall that it's it's a nice car to drive. It's got downforce. That's the main thing it has over the cigar cars. If you've ever played Grand Prix Legends, or if you've tried out the mods for games like rFactor or the expansion packs of Project Cars, you'll know that the cars that you'll see from the 60s, they certainly look great, but they yes, I said lots of trouble usually serious. Well, that's me grenading the engine, and believe me, I didn't over rev the thing, unless I only gave it half the beans rather than the full load. But there you go. Well, that was a lap in the Lotus 72. I just about made it over the finish line. Just so you can see how beautiful this thing is. This is a museum piece just a quick shot of that, and again the color scheme on these mods is perfect. So we're going to have another quick go at this because I want to try and at least get round a lap without catching fire. So taking the car out of the pits again, the Lotus 72 was campaigned by Emerson Fittipaldi primarily in 1971, and he went on to win the title in 1972. You'll see that the car has sponsorship by Gold Leaf Tobacco. That was another thing that Colin Chapman brought in 1968, I believe, where he sold the sponsorship rights to this tobacco company, and the cars changed from British Racing Green into the sort of red and gold of Gold Leaf. I've done exactly the same thing again because I locked the brakes and just run out of road. So definitely treat these cars with respect if you drive them, because they will bite back. Absolutely, they will bite back and they will have you off the road. So make sure, as I said in my hands-on drive of the 72, make sure you don't stand on the brakes too hard. Lots of gentle braking. If you need to lift off to get the wheels to start turning again, do so, then apply the brakes softly to get it to hopefully stop when you want it to. You're not really going to be able to turn too much while you've got the brakes locked up or under heavy load, so just be aware. You can drive this car on the throttle, but certainly for the later models, not quite so much for this one. The rear track is a lot wider than the front track, so be wary and watch out for the curbs, because they will pull you off course. Or you can just do what I did and use all of the track and then some. You see there, that was a clear example. Didn't quite get it slowed down enough. Didn't make the apex, ran out wide, and there's just no way you can brake and then get that back in. You just simply can't. You've got to be really careful and really precise with this stuff. That's a little bit better from my point of view. So yes, this was the sort of early generation of 72s. Not the iconic version. We're going to get to that in a second, but yeah, that was another thing I did. I caught fire this time round. I didn't just have a plume of smoke coming out the back. I managed to last another lap and then grenaded the engine again. So we're going to leave the smoking wreckage of this, and we're going to move to the iconic version of the 72. Here we go. John Player Special livery. That's one of the cars at Goodwood. We're back at Silverstone, and this is the 72E variant, which we're going to be taking a look at. Just edging my way out the pits at this stage. This is again the club circuit, so we don't go down the Hanger Straight through that section, the Vale complex and everything like that. This is just, we get down to the Beckett's complex, and then we cut back down the straight to cut across to Abbey, and then we carry on from there. So the 72E variant, this is the car that was campaigned in 1963. So it was in 1973 by Fittipaldi and by Ronnie Peterson. Peterson at that stage having been brought in to bolster the driver lineup. Lotus did have a slightly odd relationship with their sort of number one and number two drivers at this stage. They previously only had a one genuine top quality driver, and they quite often sell cars to privateers and run a selection of less talented individuals in the other cars. What this basically meant was for teams that ran a full two-car team and worked together, say for example like Jackie Stewart and Francois Sever for Tyrrell between 1971 to 73 in particular, it meant that quite often you'd get Sever backing Stewart up and taking points off of Fittipaldi and the like, and it certainly was a factor in costing him the title. in 1973. Peterson had been brought in to bolster the driver lineup, but they both ended up winning multiple races, and I don't know how much they could really have been said to trip each other up, but it was certainly the case that Sever was a clear number 2 driver and backed Stewart up. Fittipaldi and Peterson were both very talented drivers, and Fittipaldi didn't think that Colin Chapman had given him the right kind of support. He wanted a dutiful number 2 like Sever, who could have taken over the team when he left, like Sever was planning to do with Stewart in 1974. Peterson, very much having been team leader at March, was not somebody who was going to just sort of sit back and be a sort of a dutiful Eddie Irvine kind of driver. So we're going to switch away from the 72 to have a look at a couple of the cars that are sort of contemporaries of the 72 at various points. This is the McLaren M19A from 1971. This is Denny Holmes' car. This is one of the cars that McLaren campaigned during that season. You'll see it is effectively an upgrade of the cigar design that was so popular in the 1960s, with the front air scoop. By the time you come to see the other car we're going to have a look at from 1973, the air scoop had moved to over the driver's head, where it stays to this day. The McLaren was not a particularly competitive car by comparison to the 72, and McLaren only really came good when they released the M23, which you'll have seen was campaigned by James Hunt so successfully. Fittipaldi won the title in 74. He'd gone to McLaren to say, I want to be number 1 driver, I want the team behind me, I want my teammate behind me, and he dutifully won the title at the first time of asking. So yeah, that didn't look so good. Just pretend you didn't see that. So we've got the McLaren as sort of a comparison to how the 72 looked in 1971, i.e. pretty space age by comparison to what we've got here. We're also looking at the fact that the 72 was able to go 14 mile an hour faster than the equivalent Lotus 49, just simply because of the aerodynamics. You had the wedge shape, you had the side pods. It was a wholly different way of looking at aerodynamics. I'm going to just take a trip across the grass. Going to do a light bit of mowing and come back on the Grand Prix circuit and carry on my way. And then I'm going to blow the engine up because apparently, if you're using the 1971 mod, I just can't seem to keep a Ford Cosworth in one piece for anything more than about a lap or two. So I might just, if I'm going to do that again, I might turn engine explosions off. But now we're going to cut to another 1973 car for a hot lap. This is the Shadow Ford DN1, as driven by Graham Hill, Damon Hill's father. This is the Embassy Ford, so the Embassy Hill car, which was a privateer vehicle which Graham bought off of Shadow Cars and campaigned himself. He went on to have his own car designed and built at a later stage, but this was very much when he left Brabham, and it was widely acknowledged that he was nearing the end of his career. Otherwise, the Shadow is, I think, a really attractive car, reminiscent of that era, and just looking at it, you'll see that they've taken a lot of the lessons of the 72 to heart. You've got the airbox over the driver, you've got the nice wedge shape, you've got the whole thing sort of flowing together, nice big thick wide slick tyres, and I think a cracking good colour scheme, to be honest with you. This is very much the point at which Grand Prix cars start to become the sort of more modern shape that we're used to nowadays. Obviously, all cars have the front wings, the rear wings nowadays. You start to see that the driver is more sort of fully enclosed by the car rather than lying half prone in the cigar cars of the 60s. In 1973 they brought in additional crash protection, primarily at the insistence of Jackie Stewart and company. So I hope you enjoyed that little look at some old F1 cars and some trivia, and I'll see you again hopefully next time. Thanks ever so much for watching. Bye.